All right, we're recording.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining in this afternoon for our first Trillium Zoom adult education session. It's hard to believe that the last session we had was on person, on site at Trillium at the end of February, which was, as you'll recall, the beginning of when we went to once a month sessions. This has been a very long month since the end of February. But I do want to welcome you here this afternoon. And I also want to welcome our special guest, Nancy Kelly. Nancy,
Hello.
thank you for joining in this afternoon.
Thank you.
And the purpose of this session is to talk with Nancy about the book that was published right at the beginning of 2020. I think it came out either the day before the end of 2019.
Yes, December 31st.
There we go.
Yeah.
And Pastor Nancy was previously the pastor at St. Mark's Lutheran Church. So some of us who came to Trillium from St. Mark, of course, hurried out to get her book. Some of us more quickly than others. But Nancy, you're very well known in the community. And so reading your book was very interesting because as my pastor for a number of years, I knew you in one dimension. Now you have shared with the world yourself in a very different dimension. And I want to begin our talk, and I think context is going to be really important. And the first thing I wanted to ask you is, when and where were you born?
Oh, I was born in Hollywood, California on March 31st, 1947, not long after the Second World War, in the middle of the Cold War, or in the beginning of the Cold War.
So was the Cold War something that began immediately after the war? Or was this something that developed?
Yeah, it developed for sure, but it was present very soon after the war.
And can you tell me a little bit more about your parents, your mom and your dad, and what it was that they did to support the family?
Yeah, my dad had been, before I was born, my dad had been a writer and a producer in old time radio, and quite a prominent one in New York and Hollywood. And during the war, he also worked in broadcasting with Armed Forces Radio Services with the Allied troops in Europe, and so that's my dad's part. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, completely a stay-at-home mom. Yeah, she was a big reader, big poetry lover, read all of the time.
And did you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, I had one brother, 19 years older than I, Vic, and my sister, 15 years older than I, Ginny. And so I was born because I was born after the war. You could put two and two together there. I came along after the war. And so I was the only baby boomer. My brother and sister were in a different generation in one way anyway. So there were the five of us.
Okay, and would you share with us a little bit, Nancy, about a special date that came out in your book? May the 13th, 1960 is a special date. Can you talk a little bit about that?
What a good way to ask. That's a good way to ask that question, Prijna. I'm going to have to back up a little bit to answer that question. And my dad, after the war, never could get back into the entertainment industry the way he had before the war. But somewhere in the late 1950s, he started to produce concerts for people like Ella Fitzgerald and Odetta. And that date that you mentioned was the date that he had a concert for Pete Seeger, who was a famous American folk singer, who was blacklisted for having been a communist. He was no longer a communist, but he was a controversial figure who he wasn't at all concerned about marching to the beat of his own drum. He would very easily speak up against the United States government in issues of civil rights and other issues. And so he was not only a popular folk singer, he was also a controversial folk singer. He'd been called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities in Washington, and was waiting to hear what would happen with the charge that he was in contempt of court, contempt of Congress. And so he refused to answer every question that they asked him about his friends or the work that he did. And so my dad on that date was producing a concert for Pete Seeger in San Diego, California. Yeah, and I was there. So
now I think there was some things that were happening to you that's kind of put you in a certain context in your own life at the time because of your father's career. Is that not so, Nancy?
That's true. I was 13, and so I was a pretty not a very nice person to be with in my family. I was pretty much 13, and my dad, shortly before we left for San Diego, sometime in the week previous, he received a letter from the American Legion, a carbon copy of a letter from the American Legion in San Diego, saying that they wanted to have, it was a letter to the school board of San Diego, because the concert was going to be in a public high school auditorium. And my dad got a copy of this terrible letter saying that they wanted the school board to cancel the concert because Seeger was a communist. And so I was aware that there was some tension around this concert already before we left. And the story that I tell in the book is that we were an enormously patriotic family, and my dad was the vet, and he was in the American Legion in Hollywood and loved America, and the thought that he was going to be producing a concert for someone that was declared to be or thought to be a communist was very troubling to my dad. And so I happened to be lowering the American flag at my Bancroft Junior High School in Hollywood with a team of people when my parents came to pick me up to go to San Diego, and they were dragged. I'm sure you know this scenario. Whether you ever were 13 or whether you have had children, I was being dragged along. I didn't want to go. Yeah, it was. I'm sure that I was just miserable in the back seat, and my mom and dad were in the front seat. So it's about a 2.5-hour ride to San Diego, and we took off after school. I didn't want them to pick me up at school. Oh heavens, I did not want them to be seen picking me up at school. I was an independent girl. I took the bus, there my parents were, and I had them park around the corner so nobody would see them. I'm embarrassed to say, but anyway, we took off for San Diego, and I was aware certainly that my dad had a cloud over him. He was very anxious about that concert. So that's some of the background.
And can you share with the group a little bit about the consequences for your family, and maybe a little bit about you personally, about attending that concert, going ahead and attending it?
Sure. The concert was very big on the front page of the newspaper. Like, this was a big conflict in San Diego because Seeger was well known, and because the Cold War was really pretty hot, really heating up right about then. There had been an American military pilot that had just been shot down over the Soviet Union. And so Eisenhower, who was president, was going over to Paris, I believe he went to talk with Khrushchev about that horrible thing that had happened. And so the stakes were even elevated higher because of that shooting down of an American pilot. So my dad I saw my dad read those articles in the paper, right? Very upset that his concert was going to be canceled. Plus, I'm sure he was worried about blacklisting too. I don't know if blacklisting is something that you all know about. We don't hear the word all the time now, but back in those days, especially in Hollywood, people who were in the entertainment industry were thought to have a voice to speak out against the government. And so if there was any possibility that they could be a communist or even a fellow traveler, people that followed along closely communist thinking, then they were what was called blacklisted. There wasn't actually a blacklist, but what would happen would be that they would be kept from getting jobs. And so, of course, my dad had just become, he was sort of on the rise again after being on the fall, and he was worried about losing the income for the family and the meaning that his work gave him in his life. And so the stakes were really high when he started seeing these newspaper articles. They're all mentioned in the book. There were a whole series of them, a couple days in a row. We arrived on Friday night. The concert was supposed to be on Saturday, and it went on because of an injunction. There was a lot of legal stuff happening that made it possible for the concert to go on. And so my mom and dad and I took off for the high school in the evening, nice and early, and a little bit of the tension, at least the concert was going to go on, but Dad knew that it was a very unpopular concert with some people. So when we got there, there were picketers out in front saying, "Ban the bum." And
Excuse me, ban the bum?
Ban the bum, meaning Pete Seeger.
Oh, okay.
People who didn't want him to perform. They wanted to take away his freedom to sing his songs, which could be and were critical of the U.S. government. Not all of them, but some of them. "Where Have All the Flowers Gone" was one of them. "If I Had a Hammer" was another one. There's songs that if you're of a certain age, you would be aware of. "This Land Is Your Land" he didn't write that song, but it was associated with him. So anyway, we see the picketers, and my dad just couldn't go in the front door. He couldn't go through those picketers. So he took us all the way around to the stage door, and we went in through there. And so my mom and I went and sat in the auditorium while my dad fidgeted out back, waiting for Seeger and the other opening person to come. And I loved the concert. I just loved the concert. It was the first time in my life I'd ever clapped. I was a Methodist. We didn't clap in church ever. That was not happening in those days in the church that I went to. And we clapped and we sang along together, and we reached out and held each other's hands in the aisle. The auditorium was only half full because people canceled out because of the controversy. But there was something about Seeger's music and about the way he evoked a response from a community of people that just grabbed me. So if that's brainwashing, well, that's what he was being accused of. And if that's brainwashing, then I was brainwashed. But I prefer to say that I was electrified by the energy, the positive energy in the group towards change, towards a more hopeful society. So it was a watershed moment for my dad in one way, and it was a watershed moment for me in another way. And my dad and I were at odds already, but it was a good 15 years of really being at odds.
That what
after that.
would you say that that was the beginning of being at odds, or it was just a natural part of your
I was
growing up like
already a
all teens?
teenager, and I was already at odds some with my parents. And my parents were old, you know, they were 40 when they had me. It felt old that my parents were so old. By then they were in their 50s. Yeah, and I always was a little, you know, I didn't have parents like other people's parents. My mom was deaf, and my mom and dad had gray hair, you know, so they weren't cool at all. They were smart, but they weren't cool. So I already had that kind of a thing going on developmentally.
Yes.
But now there's this other layer, you know, after the concert, during and after the concert, there came another layer. And I should mention here too that growing up in Hollywood, I grew up in a basically Jewish milieu. Well, all of my friends were Jewish in my early years. Later it got more integrated as schools came together in high school. But the Jewish people that I knew were extremely liberal and open-minded and progressive, and banning the bomb was a huge thing. The civil rights was a huge thing in the homes of my friends, you know, the peace movement. So I liked those things. It wasn't just the music. There was something in me that always from the time I was a very small child, part because of where I lived, but the idea of mixing in with people who were different from me was something that it seems to be in my genes, yeah, in my soul.
Thanks for giving us some context, Nancy. The next question that I had was, your title of your book is so interesting. Souls at Risk, Extremism in Red Scare Hollywood. Now, the second part of it is kind of like part of the context, but can you share a little bit with us about the souls at risk part? And also, one of the things that you touch on in your book is the soul.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I struggled with a title early on and had many other titles, which I won't tell you, but somehow when I was thinking about what was wrong with that whole situation, how come that situation was so controversial, and why that whole period of time was so fraught with hatred and pitting people against each other, I began to think about how well, first I thought about my own soul being at risk, and I'll tell you in a minute what I think a soul is, but my own soul was at risk. But the more that I worked on the project, I worked on it for 10 years, and the more that I worked on it, the more I realized that everybody's soul was at risk.
You mean at the time or now, at any point in time?
Well, then for sure, I could make an argument that that's true now too. I didn't write about now, but when people are being pitted against each other and hatred just foments and grows bigger and bigger, that's not the best of what God intended us to be. That's a time when our souls, our God-given souls, are at risk. And my thinking, to answer the other part of your question about my idea about souls, and I came by this just thinking about it for a long time. But I think of the soul as being a vessel or a cistern or a wellspring, you know, something round and capable of holding good things. And the good things that I think that come from the soul are things that God gave us, like the ability to connect with life, connect with other humans, connect with the environment, just to make connections, because that's how God created us, not to tear each other down, but to come close to each other and care for each other and love each other. And along the way, as I thought about my soul in that situation, I almost at one point, if not more points, but at least one clear point, felt that my soul was kind of flattening out, like it couldn't do its work to inspire me in those ways. And my mom, I mentioned that she was a real poetry lover. And when I was giving my high school graduation speech, I should tell you, my dad really tried to control everything that I said, and that didn't go over too well. So, but my mom always had a different way of approaching everything. And she slipped me very quietly a poem and said, you might want to read this. And it was Edna St. Vincent Millay's Renaissance, a poem that she wrote when she was 18. So she was the same age I was. And she ends the poem by saying, and he whose soul is flat, the sky will cave in on him by and by. And he whose soul is flat, the sky will cave in on him by and by. And oh, that really hit me. I've carried that with me for my whole life, and think of the soul then as something that can be whole and filled with goodness to inspire us to care for each other, or kind of flattening down so you almost don't even have one anymore. So I hope that answers you, Prijna.
I think it does. Thank you, Nancy. I want to step back from the with my questions to posing to Nancy. There was one small thing, or actually relatively large thing I forgot to include earlier, is to invite those who are listening in and joining in to ask questions. I had asked some people if they could send questions in advance, but if listening to Nancy and I conversing, you have a question, you can use your chat function on your device to ask your question, and time permitting, I'll pass that along to Nancy. I might occasionally take a couple questions and put them together, because if I think that they work together, but I do want to invite the audience to send in some questions if they have them. Sorry about that, Nancy.
Oh, that's good.
One of the things in your book is your approach. I found your approach to telling your story interesting, because you used a framework of your home and the rooms in your home. Why did you choose that?
Well, it didn't come to me first off. If any of you have ever done writing, you know that things come bit by bit. They don't all come at once. And I started out telling the story chronologically, which was maybe easier to follow, but it didn't. It's not the way we remember. The way we remember is kind of piecemeal. We remember this little bit here, and then after another year, we remember that little bit there. And I realized that I was remembering things I had never remembered. I was almost 60, I guess. Or maybe I was past 60 when I started writing. And yes, I was 62 now that I think about it. And I had thought that I didn't remember very much. And of course I didn't, because I was young. But when I started going through the rooms of my house, I realized how many memories were associated with those rooms. And so I chose that as the way to do it. And it bothers some people. Some people would much rather have it chronologically, but I found that it was a natural way of leading to a shallow reading of the story early, and then it develops as you go along, which is how we remember. We don't remember everything. We never remember everything, but our memories grow as we kind of tease them out. And for me, and perhaps this could be true for you too, is that placing myself in, for example, the room of disputed identity, which is right at the beginning. Yeah, oh, I couldn't believe how much I remembered. So that's why I go through the house. And I have to say too, I guess that I love the house and I love my family. Even though had a difficult relationship, I loved my family very much, and we were a very lively, in many ways, we were interested in a lot of different things. But I just love that house, and all of us who either live there or the extended family that came, it seems like that house had a special feel for all of us, and we call it 1434, as if it's the only one ever, like we think of it as a center, our home.
And one of the things I found in one of the houses interesting was that one of the rooms in your house had a very unusual name that you used.
Yes.
Can you share a little bit about why you gave it that name?
Is that one, the room of disputed identity? Is that the one you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
Everybody goes to that one. Well, it was a big parlor inside the front door with a living room on one side and a parlor on the other side. And in my sister and brother's era, they were like 8 and 11 when they moved into the house, not, sometime before World War II. And they called it the den, because that was where they went to listen to Dad's performances on the radio, a big console, old-fashioned console radio. And so when Dad was at the studio, or in New York, at the studio in Hollywood or the studio in New York, Mama and they would go in, and whoever else was there would go into the den and listen to the radio. And my sister always hoped she'd hear Dad's voice, because every once in a while he would speak on a mic, like especially if he was substituting for someone else, he would have a chance to speak. He was a behind the scenes guy, a writer and a producer. But so she always, even up until she died, she thought of it as the den. And I never thought of it as the den, which is one of many things that separated me from the others in my family. And that's because my dad had an account for one of the earliest TV. We got one, and I was little, and I always had a TV, and that became the TV room. It was no longer the den. What we did in that room was watch TV.
But there was one other thing that
there's one more.
Yes, that was a little more impactful, I think.
Yes, and it was related to the whole Pete Seeger thing. In the 50s, my dad had started a record company for real mellow romantic music. And he was just getting going with that. That was one of many, it felt like many hundreds of things he did to try and make some money and use his gifts. But after the Pete Seeger thing, he changed that record company into producing very, very hateful, divisive recordings of people who were extremists, extremely anti-communist, and the hate. I put an emphasis on the hate in those recordings. And at a certain point, he moved his secretary into that front room, into the den or the TV room, and that room became the corporate office of Key Records. So we had not, in our house, we had nonstop propaganda. We had nonstop people coming in to talk about how the communists were overthrowing the government, all the conspiracy theories. Our dining room table was always covered with propaganda. That my dad also bought a printing press, and he printed very hateful propaganda. You can see some comparisons with today. I think some of the things, especially what we read out of the state, white supremacist type things. So, yeah.
That's where you've gone with this is interesting, because one of the questions was, because your father was openly anti-communist.
Right.
And so bringing it forward, do you think that the communist issue from then has kind of morphed into a socialism issue now?
I don't know. I could perhaps, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a chapter I kind of chuckled at when I was reading it, you actually have a chapter in your book called The Stairs, like, like talking about the kitchen, the dining room, the breakfast room. But when I saw this chapter, The Stairs,
Yeah.
it was humorous, and yet it wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you
especially
share
at the top? Yeah. Well, there's several things regarding the stairs. One very tender memory I have of my father happened. Do you all know what a newel post is in old houses, or even in new houses, but especially in old houses? The kind of platform at the bottom of the banister. On the newel post every morning at a certain point in my life, then my dad put a vocabulary word on there. Oh, and I couldn't stand that he did this. It was so loving, and it came totally from hoping that I would be smart and I would be able to manage good communication. And I thank him now. But oh, I thought it was such a pain that no other kids on the block or in school, nobody's fathers gave them a vocabulary word that they had to learn by the end of the day and use in front of him, But he thought that was important, because something we haven't talked about is that he grew up in Appalachia in West Virginia, and he grew up very poor and not illiterate, because he was always smart, but in his family there would have been people who were illiterate. And had he not had the good fortune of meeting my mom and my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, hiring a professor to teach him how to talk, my father never would have been able to do the kind of work that he did in the entertainment industry. So he didn't want me to sound like poor white trash. He was going to be darn sure. It was his third shot at a kid, like I was his third one. He'd been through the war. And he wanted to make sure that I got words, and I did. So, he taught me a lot. Somewhere right here, I have the box, and I keep it on my desk all the time. So that was the beginning of the stairs. That was right at the bottom of the stair. And at the other memory that I could share is at the top of the stairs, there was a window seat in front of a big bunch of windows looking out at the neighbors. And I have a memory of sitting there. My sister was 15 years older than I, and she died right after the book was published. So it's kind of tender for me to even to talk about it. But she really, I was her child, I was her live baby doll, kind of. And I remember sitting on that window seat up at the top of the stairs, and having her. I have the clear memory of her folding down my socks. But we haven't talked about alcoholism yet. That's important here too.
Yes.
That my father, and to some extent my mother, then later my sister and my brother, that alcohol was a problem in our family. And but when I was younger and my parents were not always able to tune in to what my needs were, my sister took care of me. And I have this memory of her turning down my socks very carefully, those little lacy, pretty little girl socks and Mary Jane's. I have this memory of her doing that as we were sitting on this window seat. And I came, the window box was filled with old newspaper clippings and things. It wasn't something, you didn't look through there. It was all musty and old. But I came to see it as sort of a metaphor for like a Pandora's box of scary things where all of these people that my dad was conversing with are all over the United States who hated communism and wanted to make sure America remained pure white, that they were all in there, and they started coming out and joining all of our family discussions. So they're probably not names that you would know, but they came and joined us at our dinner table. And thinking about the stairs and that window seat, the part underneath, just made me think that something I'd never thought before. It was like they became members of the family. They were right there all the time. And my dad just preached at us all the time. Because he was trying so hard, I think, to prove he wasn't a communist. I've had, if I can deepen that just a little bit, an interesting thing that's happened in writing the book is that my cousins who are mentioned in the book have read the book, and they have talked with me about how their parents saw my side of the family. And one of the comments was that my mom and dad were very progressive, that they were not in any way negative, narrow-minded people. And that they were told by their parents that when my dad was accused of being a communist, really, he wasn't accused of being a communist. Pete Seeger was, and he was associated with Pete Seeger. But something about that made my dad go all overboard trying to prove that he was not like Seeger. So anyway, those people that he hung out with, some of them were members of the Los Angeles police force who were part of something called the Red Squad that went hunting for communists in Hollywood. There were Red Squads all over the United States, but my dad became associated with the Red Squad in Los Angeles. And the hard part of that is that they were hunting my friend's parents.
That really came out in the book, that your father's activities, the things that he chose to do both for work, like because the key records was his work, and as you mentioned, the kind of music he published at the time was lot of hate-filled stuff.
It wasn't music, it was spoken word by then mostly.
Oh, it was okay. What your father chose to do had a huge impact on you. I was astonished to read that. It got to the point where at one time, to a large extent, your mom and dad needed to leave.
Yes.
And they did not take you.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
And you were cared for by your sister.
Yes, yeah. My sister saved my life. My sister and her partner saved my life. If I don't know what on earth I would have done without their care for me. You want me to talk about that?
Yes, I would. And not only that, but you were still not necessarily a child, but I was 18. Not an adult.
Yeah, yes. I was 18. I was about my grandson's age. I was at the very end of 17 and going, just becoming 18, and just graduated from high school. I was at the top of my game. I felt like I was on my way to university. I felt good about myself. I was in a good place. And then the day after I graduated from high school, my mom and dad said, well, we're going on a trip to celebrate your graduation. And we're going to the beach. So pack your swimsuit, and we're going to the beach for a couple days. And we went to a nice hotel on the beach in Oceanside. And I thought, this is kind of odd because nobody ever mentioned this trip before. So I did feel like it was like impulsive or something. My radar was up. And then people started coming to the hotel room, and I never went down to the beach ever the whole weekend. These people kept coming to the hotel room, including my sister, my dad's secretary, some other folks, and they were plotting something I didn't understand. And at the end of that time, my mom said, Nancy, we're going back to Hollywood, and your dad is leaving. Yeah, and then I don't remember if I knew she was going to join him later yet or not, or if I could even take that in, because my mother and father never would have traveled apart. So anyway, we got on the train, and we went back to Los Angeles Union Station. And my mom called a taxi cab to take us home. But the taxi cab didn't go to our house. It went to, things got really like intrigue, and everything had to be very hush hush and odd. And so we went to the Beverly Hills Hotel, and my sister met us there and took us home. And what had happened, the reason for that scenario is that my dad, with members of the police for the Los Angeles police force and other folks who were in the anti-communist movement, helped smear a Los Angeles senator, a California senator, by saying that he'd been caught in a homosexual act in the La Brea tar pits. And what I want to say here is that was a real affront, both to the senator, Thomas Kuchel, but also to the whole gay community in Los Angeles. Have this all over the paper as if this was some terrible thing that could ruin a progressive Republican senator's career, and also to my sister, who was gay. And so they had done a terrible thing. My father and his new friend, he had a whole new group of friends, and they smeared this senator, and the word got out the week before I graduated from high school that there were going to be subpoenas issued, and somehow through the grapevine, my dad was told he had to get out of town because they didn't want him testifying. And so he left, and then my mom joined him, and they were gone for the rest of the year. And I went to live with Ginny and her partner, Margaret, and they took me in.
Thank you, Nancy. I know talking about some of this, and it came out to me very clearly in the book. There were some things that were humorous, and there were some things that were, and even with the humor, there was to me, the reader, there were times when I was smiling and wiping out tears.
That's how it was. My dad was a comedy writer. I don't think I ever mentioned that. But we did have a lot of humor.
Yeah. And now this is a question from somebody that submitted it to me. Going through the process of writing the book and examining your history, your personal history, and also examining some broad-ranging, very impactful current events, what did you learn, both good and bad? And I'm not sure if the question was about yourself or about events, but I'm going to try and leave it a little narrow. What did you learn, both good and bad, about yourself?
Well, I learned some things about resilience and I learned some things about grace, for sure. When our faith tells us that God's grace is sufficient, I believe that with my heart. I didn't have it's like all of the underpinnings were knocked out from under me when my parents left town. And my sister and her partner, they didn't pay that much attention to me all the time. They were really loose with me. I could have been almost have been in a dormitory some of the time, kind of a wacky dormitory, but it wasn't like they parented me. They didn't tell me what to do or check on my day all the time or anything, but they did take me in, and we did have some really good times together. But I learned along the way that I guess I must have said to myself, well, if anybody's going to protect me now, it's going to have to be me. And it was clear that there was that parental part saying, you need to be home, Nancy, you need to be home by midnight, and you must not telling us ahead of time, those kinds of things, that the kind of infractions that I did. And my dad was really big on that. You can't wear fashion boots, and you have to, he was very clear about my fashion choices. So that was gone overnight. That was gone. Even though I was becoming an adult, that would have, because I would have been in the same house as my parents, that would have continued. But
Oh, have we lost Nancy? Larry, have we lost Nancy? Yes, I think we've lost Nancy. Oh no, there's Nancy. Nancy, you're muted. Can you take yourself off mute? Oh, there you go. Can you hear me, Nancy?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
I can. Yes, we lost you there for a half a minute.
So everybody knows that I have a formidable voice. Like, I'm sure that I learned that because, number one, my mother was deaf, and in order to communicate with her, I've used any method that I could. But also, I think I overdeveloped it sometimes, because if I could be formidable, I could protect myself. And I was, I'm a little person, so I think my voice, something that I learned to protect myself, I probably overlearned. Yeah, but on the more positive side, I learned the value of beauty and of music and of art and poetry and novels and the artistic side, colors, to nourish your soul when the rest of your life isn't cooperating. And I can't say enough how much that more artsy side, and my sister was an interior designer, so certainly I was exposed to a lot of art through her, but not just through her, art and nature and those kinds of things. But also one other area is how powerful public life is in sustaining people who are not getting what they need in their private life. And so things like public libraries, I just lived in a public library, things like the public bus, there's a lot about that in the book. Things like public parks, those things meant life to me. So those are some of the things.
Thank you, Nancy. I know that was a challenging question, because that's why I was.
It's good question.
Well, thank you to the person that submitted it. And then this was a comment from someone who's listening in and saying that being close in age, this person noticed the similarity in some of your experiences to what that person experienced in Toronto. So it was very much, some similarity of experiences. So, which is an interesting observation. And
I hope that person will contact me. I invite that person to contact me.
And then I'm just looking at some other questions that I'd like to slip in here. This is, I think, an interesting one. As you wrote the book, did you begin to understand your parents with a new appreciation?
Oh, definitely. And to there's a lot of parts to that question, Prijna, but
Yes.
but one of them is, it never occurred to me, I don't think it occurs to most people growing up, that they're part of a particular context, politically, socially. You're just growing up. You don't really consider what your parents have gone through as having an impact on you. You just, that's just what's, it's like now little kids growing up, masks are normal to little kids, but they're not normal to the older people. So you don't really consider it as anything but how it began. And there's a quote in there, Prijna, that I hope you'll read eventually, but a quote from Maya Angelou about how we grow up in a context that has problems, and we can't. I'm going to read it. I'll read it. From Maya Angelou, the American poet.
And this is the dedication at the front.
It's not the dedication, but it's the,
pardon me.
Epigraph at the beginning, dedicated to my sister, but this is the
Oh,
epigraph.
that's right, sorry.
And she says, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And I'll read it one more time. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And when I saw that quote, I had, just like so many things in the writing process, I had many epigrams at the beginning of the book, but when I saw that one, I read it when she died, when Maya Angelou died, and I thought, no, that's the one. That's why I wrote this book, in hope that we won't live that again. But the other part about my parents, you asked about my parents, right?
Yes.
About, did I learn about my parents? And
understanding them with a new or a different appreciation.
Yeah. And I have had a very difficult time forgiving my father, in particular. And I had an experience. I think we're coming to the end here. Are we, Prijna, kind of close to the end? Or?
We are, yes.
Okay, so I'll try and make this brief, but I think it's significant that I had an experience giving another book talk recently where I was asked the question, have you forgiven your father? Actually, it's happened twice. And I said no. And I was standing in the pulpit of a church when I said I hadn't forgiven my father. And it just didn't sit very well with me afterwards, because that, up in front of the church is where always the words of grace come. And I had said that I hadn't forgiven my father, and it was true. And especially for the times my father used me as a part of his project. And if you haven't read the book, that's all in there. And I just couldn't forgive him for taking away my adolescence and even my young adult life to some extent. And I knew I had to work on that there was some unfinished business there that I hadn't really, I could tell the story of what happened, but what that did, and I could even say what it did to my heart, but it felt unresolved. And it's still unresolved as I talk to you now. It's not like everything's all resolved, but I happened to take a walk with a friend who's a pastor in another denomination, my very first friend from KW when we first moved here in 1985. And I was talking with her about this, and she said that when she's had questions from parishioners who don't think that they are worthy to take communion because they haven't forgiven someone. And what she says to them is, well, if you think it through, do you think you're moving in the direction of forgiveness? I want to say that twice. Do you think you're moving in the direction of forgiveness, or do you think you're moving deeper and digging a deeper and deeper hole into not forgiving that person? And that was so powerful to me when she said that, because yeah, I'm definitely moving in the direction of forgiving my father. And the insight that I've had most recently is how much I love my father. And you can't, like the love and forever not forgiving, those just don't go together. There's something that's discordant about that. I truly love my dad, and my dad made many positive contributions to my life, and some of which I've mentioned. But also in the time after the book, he was just the best grandfather to our daughters, Jen and Sarah. He was so good. And he would have been to his great grandkids if he'd lived. He died when I was only in my 30s. So I wish I'd had him longer so that we could have talked all this through.
Well,
Yeah.
we actually, Nancy, Larry was a very smart man, and he booked us a good block of time. So if you're comfortable with staying, I do have a couple of other questions that have been sent in, and they're actually quite interesting.
Okay, sure. I love to answer them.
Yeah, one of them, the question itself intrigues me, and it's to ask you a little bit about the symmetry of the Seeger story, because it weaves its way in and out of the book.
Yeah. So there was the concert, and you know how that went, but that wasn't the end of the story, because in 2009, when I was sitting in my office at my study at St. Mark's, and I got a telephone call from our daughter Jana saying, you gotta, Mom, you gotta turn on the radio or look on the internet, because something has happened that's about our life. And I was fortunate that I was at a place where I could do that. So I looked on the internet, and the story that I saw was that the San Diego School Board had chosen to forgive Pete Seeger. They'd chosen to apologize. I didn't say that right. They'd chosen to apologize to Pete Seeger for what had happened. But something that I forgot, a very important thing I forgot to mention early on, is that they had required him to sign something called a loyalty oath before he could sing in that venue. And he refused to sign it because he was a nonconformist, and because he didn't believe in loyalty oaths. He believed in freedom of speech. And they apologized to him publicly. And my sister had just sent me the files, my dad's files. Yeah. And Jana had been the one to read those. And so she knew that our family story, and that it was all one story, that we were part of history. We're all part of history. And so she wanted me to hear right away that this story that we talked about at home, that there was something redemptive happening, like a circle. It felt like a circle was coming into its own and coming back to itself. And so that was all over the news, because Pete Seeger was a powerful, a very prominent folk singer, and there was no blacklisting anymore. He was singing in the media. And just that moment of that apology. And I should say that the person who brought the motion to the San Diego School Board, this is like 50 years later. This is a long time coming to apologize. Yeah, but she was from a family of Japanese people who were interned during the Second World War. And so she was very sensitive to issues of justice and peace. And she knew about this, and she just thought it was wrong. And she said, we have to apologize to this guy. That never should have happened. And so when I heard that, of course, you could probably all guess what I first did. I called my sister on the phone immediately, and I said, are you aware of this? And we were just dancing because there had been this apology, and we, of course, we wish that our dad and mom had been able to hear it too, and figure that they have in some way. And so I heard about it on, what's the name of the program on CBC, As It Happens.
Oh,
It was a feature on there that night, and I was up all night writing a letter to Pete Seeger, and that's in the book, because I had to connect with him, and we corresponded then until he died. So you can see what he wrote to me. You know, we didn't have a real deep heart-to-heart relationship, but there was some point of connection there, which, circling back to the idea of soul, this man who had been like enemy number one in my family after that concert, it became someone that I actually communicated with personally.
and you said that the book took about 10 years to write. So
Right.
it seems to me if you hadn't already been thinking about writing this down, it was certainly part of your decision to write all this down. That
Oh, very much so. I knew right then.
2009.
I knew right then I had to begin jotting things down. So I was still, until 2013, I was still at St. Mark's, and I only just jotted things down, and I didn't have a clear idea. I had a clear idea of where I was headed, but how I'd get there, I didn't have a clear idea of yet. And then when I retired, you know, I told everybody when I retired that this is what I was going to work on, and I finally was able to get a publisher at the end of last year. So
Yeah, I must admit, Nancy, I think I asked you one of the questions I think people naturally ask when a person is retiring. Oh, what are you going to do with retirement? And you said, I'm writing. And I leapt to the conclusion because I knew you were right. One of the things you had done some test runs with was some Bible study materials. And I just, without clarifying, assumed that's what you were doing. And now,
big surprise, Prijna. It was that wasn't it.
Yeah. You can always surprise a human person. That was one of the questions, and you've already kind of partly answered it, your writing method. So it seems to me it started with jotting down memories, probably as scenarios or anecdotes to self. But then how did you pull it all together? Was that
it was excruciating. Just because it just I lost sleep over it trying to pull it together, and I'm not sure I ever completely did. But one thing that, you know, everybody knows Benjamin Lefebvre. Do you know Benjamin?
Yes.
Member of Trillium. Benjamin is a very accomplished writer about Anne of Green Gables, and he suggested that I get readers, and so I chose a group of about 20 people, and they said yes, and they read it, some of them numerous times, and gave me suggestions. Some of the people you know, some of the people are on the screen, and that was enormously helpful in putting me on a different track than I would have thought of myself. Harold Remus was one of the people too. I would mention him now because I want to mention Harold, because Harold was so instrumental, and Vern too, in starting and putting huge energy into having a vibrant adult education program at St. Mark's, and it's just beautiful to see that continuing, and struggling with a new way to try and make that still happen. But yeah, Harold was very helpful as well, and I was helpful also. I spoke at adult ed at St. Mark's when the apology first came. But the readers, I just can't thank enough for being honest with me, and being loving with me, and helping me keep moving on something, because writing a book is a very solitary experience. You don't wake up in the morning and it's kind of like being in isolation like we are now. You know, I'm at my desk now, and this is what I do. I'd come over to my desk in the front window and give it a try one more day. So Pauline, maybe some of you know Pauline Finch. She's a copy editor here in KW. And Pauline, when we talk about my process, somehow I saw that she was a copy editor, and I asked her if she would, and I hired her to copy edit my book before I submitted it to the author that eventually published it, Whip and Stock. And Pauline had worked with them, and she was enormously helpful, put hundreds of hours into making something of my story that I couldn't make by myself.
Well, when you and I chatted in planning this afternoon session and the basic formats for it, I mentioned that the first thing I did was go through your book and look at the pictures. Your pictures are a little bit of a spotlight of the second half of the 20th century, and also you've got a copy of the Pete Seeger letter to you from 2009 in there. So I really enjoyed it because although I'm close to your generation, I'm just that little bit. Some of the things about the Red Scare that was going on, which in a lot of ways was known as McCarthyism.
That's right.
You know,
right.
And it lasted a long.
It lasted a long time. The Cold War didn't end until the Berlin Wall came down.
That's right. So you're sharing you and the journey that you went through at a time when what we think of as the good old days. And it just, I found it interesting that in the good old days, there was a seamy side to it, too, a
That's
sad
right.
side and a difficult side.
There was.
And even though I haven't yet finished the book, I've kind of hopped through it because I do that with a book I like. I hop through it to get the sense of it and then go back and read all of it.
You're not alone in doing it.
And I want to thank you, Nancy,
You are welcome.
For sharing. And from me, it seemed that some of my questions dug into your heart a little bit. And I want to thank you for sharing your heart and with us this afternoon.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me. And Larry, thank you to you too.
And before we sign off, if you have a question that you have a burning need to ask, add it to the chat list right now, because meanwhile, I'm going to put a little bit of a plug in for Nancy's book if there are those of you that don't already have it. That the book is called Souls at Risk, Extremism in Red Scare Hollywood. It is published by Whip and Stock and can be purchased directly from the publisher. It can be purchased at the Wordsworth Books on King Street in Waterloo. It can also be purchased at Chapters. Now, the Chapters stores may not have it on their shelf, but you can order it from them in print format, delivered directly to your home. It can be purchased from Amazon in print format and delivered to your home. And you can also order it in Kindle format, which is what I did. And the pictures, even in the Kindle format, were really good. And you can purchase it in Kobo format from Chapters Indigo online. And the Kindle format is from Amazon. I'm just going to look and see if there's any questions that have come in. No.
Waterloo
nothing.
Public Library, Prijna, and everybody has it as well. Waterloo Public Library. I don't know about Kitchener, but Waterloo has it.
Okay. Kitchener didn't when I checked, but I will admit that was a couple of months ago. So that may have changed, of course. So, and no further questions have come in. So thank you so much again, Nancy, for talking with us about your book this afternoon. And not only that, being the leader of digital Zoom sessions for adult education at Trillium. So thank you very much, everybody. And we hope to begin having a somewhat regular sessions of adult education in the new year. We don't have specific plans yet, but we do have some ideas that we're working on, and you'll be hopefully, if you have any comments about the format of this session, please let us know. And again, thank you very much, everybody, for coming this afternoon, and Nancy.
Peace be with you, everybody.
Peace be with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prijna, for doing a great job.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Nancy. It was wonderful.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Prijna, for a wonderful job.
Oh,
You're
thank
so
you.
fun. Thank you.
This was a good idea, Prijna.
Oh, I'm not exactly sure whose idea it was. I think it was very, very collaborative.
Well, that's okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Bye.